I expect you noticed that. The idiomatic English way of expressing the same idea would be, and here it is, the apostle who is saying these things in the temple. The apostle who is saying these things in the temple. Now, the difference between the attributive use of the participle and the use which appears in example 1, that is, paragraph 232, the adverbial use, should be noted very carefully. In the sentence, O apostolos legon tafta ento euro vlepi toni kyrion, the participle legon, being in the predicate, is not in the attributive. It goes only somewhat loosely with O apostolos. In other words, what he's saying is, if it doesn't have the article, it goes more with the verb. If it has the article, then it modifies the noun and should be diagrammed under that noun. That's what he's saying. So I don't think we need to do any more on that page. You should read it, but it's not going to be worth our time to go over that. Except to look at his example, paragraph 1 or page 108. I saw the apostles while they were saying these things. Or I saw the apostles saying these things. Now, the first is better. I saw the apostles while they were saying these things. That's the adverbial use. And then he says, I saw the apostles who were saying these things. Now, he's given us two different examples. The first example at the top of the page is legondos without an article. In the next sentence, he's showing us that when legondos has the article, then it's attributive, it is adjective use, and he's pointing out which apostles. I saw the apostles who were saying these things. So the attributive participle then will be adjectival. Now, we have that in the workbook as well. So take a look at page 29 again, and let's go back through this chart just quickly. First of all, you have to say what position is it. If it's predicate position, that is, it is not preceded by the article, then remember you diagrammed it under the verb and translated by the means of a temporal clause. Now, what about if it does have the article? If it's attributive, that is, it's preceded by the article, then you have to ask the next question because there are two possible uses. You have to say, what use does this participle have? Is it adjective use or noun use? Or, in other words, is there a noun for the participle to modify or not? A, adjective use. There is a noun for the participle to modify. Then what do? Well, number one, it's diagrammed under that noun, and the participle is translated by the English relative clause, see page 32. So now we can go to page 32 and see how that works. And here it is. The participle, attributive position, adjective use. The Greek construction, note, the participle appears with the article and a noun to modify. O legon tafta vlepi kyrion. If we used a simple English translation, English participle would be the apostle saying these things sees the Lord. If we used a relative clause, a relative clause, the apostle who is saying these things sees the Lord. Now, that's the way we want to do it. Now, apostle is in the sentence, but the who and is are not. It's simply the apostle saying. So we've added two words, who and is. Well, we've done this to make it into a clause. A relative clause begins with a relative. There are two relatives, the who and which. Well, who we use here because the subject of the relative clause is determined by the gender of the noun it modifies in the English sentence. Who, if it's a person, so that would be a masculine and feminine, or which, if it's a thing. So is it a person or is it a thing? This is a person. It's the apostle who. Then the is that we have there is determined the same way it was with the verb, with the adverbial use on the previous page. The helping verb is in the relative clause is determined by the time of the main verb of the sentence. So if the main verb is present or future time, then you use is, or plural you use are. Past time you use was or were. So is or are, was or were, depending on the main verb. in this sentence, the main verb is present, therefore we're using is. Now you see this in the diagram. We diagrammed the participle under apostolos because it agrees with it, it modifies it, being an attributive participle modifying this noun. So it's the apostle who is saying these things sees the Lord, or as you see the English diagram there. So that's how you handle the adjective use. That's probably the easier one. And now he says in page 108, paragraph 235, the substantive use of the participle. The participle, like any other adjective, can be used substantively with the article. It will be remembered that, I'm reading Machen, it will be remembered that o agathos means the good man, or e agathi, the good woman, ton agathon, the good thing, e agathi, the good man, the good men. So in exactly the same way, o legon tata entoiro means the saying these things in the temple, man. There's no noun for it to modify, so it takes the case of the participle, which is masculine, therefore it's man. The participle with its modifiers is just like an adjective, tells what man we're talking about. But how shall the same idea be expressed in idiomatic English? There are various ways to relate this. For example, we could say the man who says these things, or we could say the man who is saying. Now I prefer the latter, the bottom. The man who is saying these things in the temple. And forget the rest of it. The man who is saying these things in the temple. That's what we want. Now the rest of it is simply saying why that is. We won't bother with that. Examples. The following example should be examined, he says. I saw, and I want to change that, I saw the man who was saying these things. I saw the man who was saying these things in the temple. Number 2, I saw the men who were saying these things. Nothing more, nothing different, just that. I saw the men who were saying these things. Because the participle there is plural, you see. The brother of the woman who is saying these things is a servant. Now look, he uses is. Notice your main verb is estin. That's why he's using is as a helping verb. Look at the first example in that light. I saw the man who was. See? Was because your main verb is past time. And the helping verb will be was. Rail down the line. All of those are showing you how to use a noun participle, or the noun use of the participle. Let's look at the flip chart again and see if we can relate this to the noun use. Now, quickly we'll go back through the flow chart. What position is it? If it's predicate position, it's adverbial, diagramming under the verb, translated by use of a temporal clause. If it is not predicate, but rather attributive, then you have to ask the next question, what use does it have? Well, if there's a noun for it to modify, then it'll be adjective use. And it's diagrammed under that noun that it modifies, and is translated by a relative clause. Now, if there's no noun for it to modify, then it's noun use. There's no noun to modify. Then we have to ask the next question, because then we have to know what function does it have. If it's going to be a noun used in the sentence as a noun, where is it going to be used? That's the question. But what function? What part of the sentence? And that's determined by the case. If it's noun, if it's a nominative, it could be subject, could be a predicate nominative. If it's an accusative, remember, anything that a noun can do, a noun participle can do just as well. So, if it's accusative, it could be direct object. It could be object of a preposition. If it's a dative, it could be indirect object, object of a preposition. Could be, we know already now, object of a special verb that takes a dative. Could be dative of means, paragraph 115. If it's a genitive, it could be a possessive, object of a preposition. In other words, anything a noun can do, a noun use of the participle can do just as well. Maybe better. So, if you determine that, then it's diagrammed in the place of its function. whether it's subject, object, whatever. And it is translated by a relative clause. See pages 33 to 36. So you go to pages 33 and 36, and there you have the examples of the noun use. Now you see this one, the substantive or noun use. The participle has the article, but there is no noun to modify, so it's noun use. The phrase serves as a noun in any of the following cases as a subject. Here's a construction. O pistevon is ton vlepi ton kidion. Now notice, o pistevon, that's the participle. There is no noun for it to modify, see? So, you know that it's going to take the place of a noun. It is nominative, therefore you expect it to be the subject. Subject of this verb. Now, the English participle phrase, the man believing in the Lord, believing in him sees the Lord. An English relative clause, which is what we're going to use, will say, the man who is believing in him sees the Lord. Now, man, because, just like we did with o agathos, we said the good man. We got the man from the fact that it's a masculine article and it's a masculine form of the participle. Who, using the relative pronoun, we're referring back to man. Man is a person, therefore we use who. If it were a thing, we'd use which. And we use is the same way we've used it previously. Its present tense helping verb is when the main verb is present. And if it were past time main verb, we use was, etc. See these other pages that we've been using. So the translation would be, the man who is saying these things sees the Lord. It's possible to have the man who was believing in him saw the Lord. For instance, see we have a Saul there now, and that would be this one. The man who was believing in him saw the Lord. And because this is Saul, a past time, then our helping verb is going to be was. Over here, where the helping verb is, where the main verb is present, then we would say is. The man who is believing in him sees the Lord. Present time main verb is. Past time main verb was in our clause. Now we go on with the illustrations and we're doing these right out of Machen on that same page, on page 109. So you can follow along with those. If it's a direct object, diagram it in the direct object spot. And then translate it. I come to the man who is saying these things. Is saying. Present time main verb. That's why we're saying is saying. Object of a preposition. See, it can be this structure is better. I had it, this could be up some. But in any case, we're talking about the object of a preposition. Pros. And then the object of pros takes the accusative, so you have accusative participle. And so on. Other uses. Indirect object. He says these things to the men who are believing in the Lord. See? A dative is diagrammed under the verb. This is a dative noun for all practical purposes. He says these things to the men who are believing in the Lord. To the men who are believing, it's plural, and you have a present time main verb. So it's just a matter of going through the constructions, doing the getting these usages down. I'd say take doing your homework. Just go through for every participle you get, go through that chart. Go through the everything. Say, well, if it's this, go to this page, diagram it out. And of course, you're diagramming these before you do much else. But just follow it through, and I think that this will come very clear to you. One helpful thing for you, and that is that we're doing participles in this chapter, then in chapter 19, and again in chapter 20. And we're not going to learn anything new about usage. We'll just have a different translation of the participle itself, and then everything else will be the same. So get that in mind. And one thing you can do, which will be helpful, especially if you're taking for credit, paragraph 236, I'd like for you to learn that, like you did other paragraphs, This is a summary paragraph, and you should learn that together. So, for instance, you should know, if I give you active, middle, and passive, you ought to be able to give that the verb forms and the translation. The same is true with the next one. We only need one translation, however, for, say, the present participle of the article, O Leon, the loosing man, and then equals the man who is loosing. You have to write that in with all those possibilities. Machen didn't hit mine, or I didn't fit one of his, or whatever. You can just make it the man who is loosing. That's what we'd like to have. The rest of them you can ignore. One translation for each one. For the middle, the man who is loosing for himself. The man who is loosing for himself. On the next page, the man who is being loosed. And the next one, to leon, the thing which is being loosed. And e leondes, the men who are loosing. The men who are loosing. Remember, the present participle is translated loosing, simply loosing. The present active participle. The passive is translated being loosed. You won't have any use for the translation loosing for himself. You will only have loosing, present participle, being loosed, present active, and being loosed, present passive. Now, in the homeworks, you should only do the Greek to English. You can do some English to Greek if you'd like, but there are different things that can happen there. So I would rather simply for you to spend your time on the Greek to English. We'll only do 10 for credit, and then you can do others for your own help. But do those, do 10 Greek to English, and then you might want to read ahead a little bit to the next participles, and you'll see how much alike they are. And when we come back, we'll be looking at the aorist participle, active and middle.